I would say we can get a long way towards it, I think. And mainly because I think this comes down to what does it mean to be quote unquote a human being? And I would argue that number one, we all don't have the same background, which I sort of pointed to earlier. Um, but that ultimately, as I hinted at earlier as well, what seems to be the case is that, for instance, we never run into a situation when an alien shows up and there's just a language translation issue and they throw their hands up in the air and say, sorry, I don't know how to translate. I don't speak English. No, they just telepathically communicate. There seems to be this cosmic connection across all sentience, which again, this is spoken to in idealism. This is kind of hinted at with the revelations of quantum mechanics that everything's actually one, everything's interconnected, everything's entangled. And in that sense, you're actually seeing different fractal impressions of yourself when you're encountering these different beings, which means that to call yourself a human being is actually perhaps too narrow. And some of our ancient non-dual traditions have spoken to this, that actually when you meditate, when you deeply meditate, and your brain begins to sort of drop out because you're not feeding it, you're not responding to it, and then suddenly you expand into the cosmos kind of thing, you expand into everything, which speaks to the entangled nature. So again, when people say that sounds again like new age kind of wishy-washy stuff, I would say this is what quantum physics is pointing towards. This is what the ancient non-dual traditions spoke to, that actually everything is one. And because of that, all of the separations are illusory and the boundaries are porous, which is exactly why they can telepathically communicate, why we can telepathically communicate with each other, why we can sometimes, they definitely can do this, and some human beings can do this to some degree, telekinetically move objects with their minds, right? So again, with the abduction phenomenon, one of the questions is, how do they move people through walls, right? And this gets complicated too, because I think there's different levels of consciousness development. And the further you get in that journey, the more you're able to author at that level I was speaking to earlier that is prior to space-time. So you don't even have to move atoms, for instance, because you're working at the source code kind of level. There are some beings that do just have a more sophisticated external technological understanding where they can move the atoms in such a way that they can then pull people through walls. But there are other beings that don't seem to need spacecraft whatsoever. They can just, through thought alone, move across, again, space-time, because space-time is just one modulation of consciousness. Um, so I would really, really encourage people that it's a both and. I think we can learn a lot through science, but science needs to humbly, um, with an understanding that science always tends to eventually outdo itself. And we have these revolutions, right? Thomas Kuhn talked about this in terms of the history of scientific revolutions, that um, first you get a bit of disruption after you've had a period of everyone believes the same thing. And there's more and more outlier data until you eventually have this revolution where at one point you have one subset of science that believes something completely new and another subset from before. And those are no longer even in conversation with each other because they're so fundamentally different. But eventually, the new one takes over and everyone goes back into stasis and assumes this has always been the case until the next one arises. So we need to be aware that we're on a journey of understanding ourselves, understanding the cosmos, understanding the nature of reality, and that I would argue that even the arising of these intelligences in our midst is part of the next revolution that we're in the midst of. People like Bernardo Kastrup would again say that we're moving back towards idealism, that this idea of reductionistic materialism was just a few century kind of anomaly in the full history of humanity. So absolutely, I would say as much as we want to have a multidisciplinary scientific engagement, I really encourage people to work on their own consciousness development, not just because it makes you a more healthy member of the human species, makes you wiser, and then that makes us wiser as a collective to address some of the challenges we're facing, which need an uptick in consciousness, but also because that takes you into an understanding of reality that's deeper, that's more expansive, that actually not only changes the way you see reality, but it changes, I would argue, the way you interact with reality, the way that reality manifests, which again goes back to what I was saying before, the observer effect. Not only does it collapse one reality into being over another, but then perhaps even the way that reality ongoingly manifests is determined to some degree by our consciousness. So when you look at quantum physics, you realize science is really taking us back to the same direction. And it's really going to be quite something, because I think eventually we're going to have this reckoning in science where we say everything we thought about the fixed world was just a particular perceptual measurement, basically. And that we see that that changes over time because we recognize you fundamentally can't separate the observer, the consciousness, from the thing it's trying to observe, that there's a connection there. And then eventually we begin to realize that everything that's manifesting in front of us is just one modulation, like a dreamscape, and that we can eventually realize that we can co-author in the same way that you can, as I do in lucid dreams. Once you wake up in the dream, then you can actually start saying, I want to go left. I don't want to go right. I'm going to do this. I'm going to try that. So I think that's what lies in our future, which is fascinating and enticing, but it's also, I think, a future we need to arrive at to address some of the concerns we're facing as a collective, because I think those are primarily consciousness questions, not physical questions. It's not going to be just external technology. And that's the final point I make, is that in my conversations with Bernardo Kastrup, we talked about there being two different kinds of technology. There's a more advanced external technology, which some of these beings seem to demonstrate. But there's also eventually the ultimate technology is consciousness technology, where you're working at that source code level prior to space-time. And once you get there, then almost anything's possible. And some of those beings seem to be working there. Again, historically, religious history, shamanic history, we might have called that magic. But as Arthur C. Clarke said, that, any sufficiently sophisticated technology is going to look like magic. This speaks to where they're coming from. It speaks to what this ultimately all is and what we're learning about it as we go.